most of the economic growth that the world, not the US, the world has experienced since 1990 is that we've brought in an empire worth of raw materials from the Russian space. And we've brought in 1 billion workers from the Chinese space. And the outputs from both of those systems have allowed Brazil to bloom in a way that it never could before. We're now seeing all of that in reverse. And if you remove a lot of the added fertilizer that's come into the situation, then the 2.5 billion people that we have added since 1990 are in some very real danger. Because Brazil is the world's second largest agricultural exporter. Russia is the world's largest exporter of wheat. Ukraine is number 5, and Chinese capital has been part of what's made this all work. And we've seen an increase of the Chinese lifespan by over 40%, 50% since 1990. You know, these things are all linked together. And when you take away the food supply that has allowed all of this to happen, we get to a very dark place very, very quickly. And you cannot replace fertilizer supplies quickly. Nitrogen and phosphate take a minimum of 3 years. Potash usually takes 10. And so far, we've only lost roughly 1/3 of the former Soviet Union's output of this stuff. And that has already been enough for almost every producer in the world to have gone through all of their reserves. The only reason we're not in a food crisis already is because people had reserves, and Mother Nature was very, very kind to us this past year. There's no way we're going to repeat that next year. We're in this weird situation where the Biden administration is trying to provide letters of comfort to point out to financiers and shippers that these things are not under sanctions in order to limit the damage. But if you're a financial house and you see these sanctions getting tighter and tighter and tighter, and with every new genocide that the Russians propagate, you got to wonder whether you want to be affiliated at all. So most, to this point, of the reduction in fertilizer shipments, roughly 1/3, has been because companies don't want to touch it, not because they're under sanction. What's going to happen over the next years, we're starting to see industrial accidents in a lot of these places because most of the technology, most of the infrastructure that produces this stuff dates back to the 60s. And it's only been held together since 1990 with Western duct tape and technical work and people shoehorning parts into it. That's not happening anymore. So in the natural gas sector, we're literally seeing explosions at gas processing facilities that you can see from space. And fertilizers, in many ways, is a derivative of petrochemicals, especially for nitrogen. And because natural gas is caught up in the Russia-European mix, the Europeans have stopped making it at all. So it's not all just a direct interruption of Russian and Belarusian shipments. So we're seeing pressure throughout the entire supply chain in the former Soviet and European space. And we're only at the beginning of that. If Putin were to die tomorrow, I don't think it would change the course of the war. The clique that runs the Russian system broadly sees the world from the same point of view as Putin. And so you might get a difference in style, but I don't think you get any difference in the real approach to the conflict, and I don't think the war would end. The question to ask is whether or not Russia is going to win or lose this, and we don't know yet. We will know in May and June, because we're at a bit of an operational pause right now, because the Ukrainians are assimilating a lot of Russian gear that they've caught, that they've captured. They've captured almost twice as much gear from the Russians in the last 3 months as they started the war with, in addition to everything that's come in from NATO. So by the time they're done with that process in the beginning of May, the Ukrainian military will have 5 times the capacity of what it started the war with. That's just incredible. So it's going to be a very different war, but May is when mud season is over, and they can all maneuver and get at each other in a very big way. And we will know by the end of June at the latest who is going to rule at that sort of conflict, and then we can start making predictions about who's going to win. It looks a lot like the history of Russia, an inefficient state that's run by a kleptocratic aristocratic class that oppresses everyone around it in a desperate attempt to find some security. I mean, we've seen this movie before. We've seen it at least 11 times. The explosion in output that we saw since 1990 was largely because of British Petroleum, or I guess it's just BP now, and the Western services firms. They're all gone. And so we know that those fields are going to decay in time, independent of what happens with the sanctions or the tariffs or insurance. I don't want to suggest that Russia is going to go to zero, but the longer this war goes on, the greater the chance that there's going to be damage to the onshore pipelines in addition to anything that the Europeans, the Americans, and the Japanese do. So we should all consider that anything value added coming out of Russia and anything raw commodity coming out of Russia is going to drop precipitously and in many cases suddenly. But we shouldn't expect to see much of any of it coming back within the next several years. Because again, the last time it took 30 years to rebuild the capacity, and that's when the West was very tightly involved. We're not anymore. I'm not concerned about rare earths at all. That's a processing issue. And the ore that produces rare earth elements comes from almost every mine in the world as a byproduct. So it's just a question of building out the processing capacity. And once the Chinese started to try to blackmail the Japanese a few years ago, a lot of countries, the US included, built out some of that processing capacity. So if there ever was a shortage, we could kind of switch some gears and within a few months have a domestic supply. So I'm not concerned about that. It's like the one thing I'm not concerned about. Industrial gases are a messy space because every gas has its own economics, but all of them are sourced from something called an air separation unit, which just takes the atmosphere and splits it into different chunks. Most air separation is done for oxygen and nitrogen as part of steel foundries, and that's no exception when it comes to the former Soviet Union. The problem is it requires a second stage of separation in order to get the trace gases like helium and neon. And that second stage is usually done at a different facility that's more advanced. And in the case of the former Soviet Union, where 80% of the stuff comes from, that second stage was largely done in Mariupol, and all the infrastructure has been destroyed. For those of you who don't know, helium and neon are the two critical components in semiconductor etching lasers. So we are going to have a massive global shortage in semiconductor fabrication capacity within a year. We're going to have to decide what goes back to analog for a while. It's going to take 2 to 3 years to build out replacement infrastructure somewhere else. Several companies, most notably Taiwanese ones, after the last scare we had with neon, which happened back in 2014 with the last Russia-Ukraine war, have invested a lot in recycling of the cartridges that have the neon and the helium, and they've made a degree of progress, and those recycling facilities are actually located in-house. So there are some technologies under development with this and different kinds of lasers to try to slim down the need. It's not happening fast enough, but it is happening. Well, we are looking at the end of the globalized era, and that means unwinding a lot of the benefits of the globalized era, and there's nothing about that that's cheery. But we're not looking at a systemic collapse of human civilization here. I mean, we've had a number of periods in human history where when the system broke, everything broke. I mean, Europe had a millennium-long dark ages. That's not what we're looking at here. The American system is going to hold, it's going to expand, it's going to thrive, and it's going to reach out and integrate with other parts of the world that are also going to do well. And they're going to be secondary centers around the world, think of France, think of Turkey, that are also going to do pretty well for themselves. This is not a vacation from history. This is an adjustment period. Now, it's an adjustment period that's going to last 30 years. But on the other side of this, technology is going to continue to advance. And when we get through this adjustment, it's not that we're going to pick up where we left off, but we will enter the next chapter of history. This is not the end. This is just a really, really bad shakeout.